Hi there and welcome to the History Teacher. This revision video covers Weimar and Nazi Germany from the GCSE Edexcel 9-1 course. Hopefully you'll also find it useful if you're studying any of the other exam boards or if, like me, you just love history. You can now become a member to support me to continue making this content from just £1 a month. Plus you'll get exclusive access to worksheets, revision materials, and you'll get to vote on forthcoming episodes. The link is in the description. Hi there guys! Following on from last week's video on reducing unemployment, this week we're going to be taking a look at the standard of living in Germany in the 1930s and how the Nazis affected it for different groups in society. The standard of living usually refers to the economic level of an individual, family or nation. It can be measured by the value of goods, services produced or used by the individual, family or nation in a period. It's also important to note that the standard of living can be good for some and poor for others in any one society, and that the wealth of an individual can increase while their enjoyment of life decreases. The standard of living is very hard to measure accurately. One way some people measure the standard of living is by looking at the security and quality of their employment. As we saw in our last video, during the 1930s, the number of those in work did increase. This means that more people had a regular income, which would suggest that for these people, the standard of living did increase, but as we know, this does not apply to everyone. Jewish people and women were excluded from work after 1933, and therefore, for people in these groups, life would actually have got worse. Also, you will remember that some people hated the jobs that were created by the Nazis. For example, those in the RAD. So, although employment did increase, it's clear that there are some people for whom this did not mean an improvement in their living standards. Another way to measure the standard of living is wages. Wages in the Nazi period rose slowly at first and then sped up towards the end of the 1930s. But there were huge variations across jobs. For example, those working in the rearmament projects were well paid, and their wages increased throughout the 1930s. Yet those working in the RAD were on much lower wages that failed to keep up with the rises elsewhere. The cost of goods also rose during the 1930s, meaning that again we have a clear split. For those on higher wages, the 1930s saw a dramatic increase in their quality of living, they had access to more leisure activities, and car ownership trebled. But for those on lower incomes, the increase in the cost of goods meant that basics such as food and fuel became more expensive, causing a lowering in the standard of living. Add to this the increase in the working week from 44 hours to 49, those on lower incomes were working longer hours for less money. However, the Nazis knew they needed to keep workers happy as they made up the majority of the country and they needed their support. So they introduced a number of policies to keep people happy, and we're going to take a look at 3 of these. The DAP, or Labour Front, was set up to make up for a lack of the trade unions, which had normally fought for the rights of workers to ensure good pay and conditions. The DAF set out what the rights of workers should be, the number of hours in a working week, and what minimum wage should be. However, unlike the trade unions, the DAF did not give workers the opportunity to negotiate pay or conditions, and they had no right to strike. Disruptive workers were punished by the DAF. In reality, the DAF was more of a policing body, making sure that workers and employers kept the country moving and disputes over pay or conditions did not disrupt the supply chains. An entirely different organisation was the KDF, the Strength Through Joy programme. With the lack of workers' rights, the Nazis recognised they would have to keep the workers happy, so they set up the KDF as a way of making work more enjoyable. They organised leisure activities for workers, including sporting events, films, theatre visits, days out, and even foreign travel. The most common activities available were museum tours and theatre trips, with around 22 million workers visiting museums. Around 750,000 people took advantage of the holiday offers, but many of these holidays were to Nazi-controlled camps and were regimented in their structure. Probably the most famous and popular of the KDF schemes was that of car ownership. In 1937, Hitler approached Ferdinand Porsche and asked him to design a car for the German people that would travel 40 miles to the gallon. The resulting car was the Volkswagen, or People's Car. Workers were invited to save 5 marks a week from their wages in a stamp scheme, and the money raised from the stamps was used to set up the factories to build the cars. However, in 1938, the factories switched over to making munitions, and none of the workers ever got their car or their savings back, and the police state ensured that no one ever complained. The final organisation I want us to look at is the SDA, or Beauty of Labour organisation. This organisation campaigned for better working facilities. The SDA gave employers tax breaks if they built and decorated workers' facilities, such as recreation rooms and kitchens. But employers usually did not pass on the money gained and expected employees to do the work to build these facilities themselves in their own time with no pay. Some even threatened workers with dismissal if they did not work on them. Overall, it's very hard to make a judgment about the standard of living for Germans living under the Nazis in the 1930s. For some, the increased pay did improve their lives, but for others, the increased cost of living meant that life was harder, plus the increased hours at work meant they had less leisure time. The KDF activities were good for some, but only a tiny minority ever went on the holidays and the cruises, and the majority only had access to museum and theatre visits, and these were often compulsory, meaning they had to attend whether they wanted to or not. For the minority groups living in Germany, life dramatically deteriorated, which I'm going to discuss in detail in my next video. Okay, that's everything you need to know about the standard of living in Nazi Germany. Don't forget to check out my website for worksheets and revision guidance, and I will see you next time.